All right, guys, we're back. We just finished filming part 1 of this episode, talking about postmodernism, talking about what is the truth. So if you haven't seen that part,
in the same clothes.
Exactly. If you haven't seen that part, make sure you go back and watch it so that you can get context. And we're just going to dive straight back into our conversation and talk about this a little bit more.
Well, the message, you got to go back and watch the sermon, guys. I'm telling you, we've had more people in the last couple of weeks talk about how powerful that this changed their life. So we had a lot of people saying it was the best sermon they had ever heard because it did, and it made me feel real good because I wasn't preaching it. But last podcast you were talking about absolutes and how that the entire concept of postmodernism or deconstruction is that there is no absolutes.
Right.
And so now we even have a group of Christians coming up
Yeah.
that don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God, that don't believe in a literal eternity, whether it's heaven or hell, or even annihilation of the wicked. They don't even believe that. They don't believe that miracles actually happened. All of that was metaphorical. So you have all of that. And then we kind of ended the last day. If we're going to go forward as Christians, we have to make the choice that the Bible is actually the Word of God and is the roadmap, or you were talking about is the template, because you were talking about what right do you have to change something if you weren't the creator. I love this. Start with that example. Kind of start with that.
I've used it a couple of times before in different contexts, but if you look at humanity, if you look at the world as a product, as a creation, even if you don't believe that the Christian God was the creator, that if you at least will admit that there has to be some kind of force that started the universe, well, that person or that entity, that spirit, that force, whatever, has to be the authority because they're the one that created it. And what I use as an illustration is, we both have these iPads. We're Apple geeks, and I can have as my truth that this iPad, I can throw it in water and that'll be fine. But the creator of it, the manufacturer of it, says that if you get it in water, it's going to short out, it's going to ruin it, you're going to have to replace it,
and
whatever.
void all warranties.
And void all warranties. And I got into that in another sermon is, if you look at warranties like the promise of God, people want to turn their stuff in and get the promise from God, but they didn't use the product as it was intended to be used. And so I said, well, you can have a car and just a standard ignition combustion engine car, and you can say, oh well, it doesn't need oil. I don't have to use oil in my car. But the manufacturer says you have to have oil, you have to have a certain type of oil, and there's a certain place you put the oil, there's a certain amount that you put the oil. You can't put the oil in the windshield wiper reservoir and expect it to work.
Wow.
And so relating that to Christianity, even people that are like, well, I use the Bible, or I have morals, and it's like, but are you using them in the right tank, or to continue that metaphor? Yes, you're saying these things, you're saying you love God, you're saying that you're doing this, but you're not using it in the way that God has said He wants you to intended it to be. And so some people just completely ignore and cast out the Bible, and that's honestly the people that I would prefer to talk to and work with, because then it can be, okay, let's the Bible is I still think it's true and you think it's not true, so we can kind of come. But the harder part is when people are like, yeah, the Bible's true, but we don't have to do this anymore.
But it's my truth.
Or and getting back to the first episode, the whole language thing. Well, Paul said this, but that's not what he actually meant. Or Jesus said this, but that's not what he actually meant. A great example is for all of church history now, when Paul talks about sexual immorality, or when he talks about specifically homosexuality, it's been believed and taught and carried on through every culture, and homosexuality was just as prevalent, even more in Paul's day than it is now.
In the Roman culture, absolutely.
But now it's like, well, that's not what he actually meant. What he actually meant was, and this is something that was common in that day, the relationship between a successful, wealthy man and a younger man, or a man that had less power, like a slave or something. So
younger.
It doesn't. It's
even teenage.
Paul didn't. Even children. So what they're saying is, well, Paul didn't. When he said that, that's not really what he meant. Is that it's between two consensual men. He meant it as it's only wrong if it's between a man and a
It's a
young
power play,
child.
yeah.
It's a
Yeah, if it's
power
abuse.
play. So then you kind of get in this thing, well, because they're saying, oh, I believe the Bible, but they're changing again what has been, and I know like not everything we can just accept from history, but if something has stayed the course through different eras, through different when different doctrines came into the church, and it was, they kept this, they didn't change it. I think we have to take that pretty literally. And what I said, kind of, I mean, is joking, but I mean, it's kind of sarcastic. But I was like, how are we so prideful that from all this scholarship, from all these theologians for thousands of years now, people that spent their entire lives to translate one chapter of from a Greek manuscript, or one book from a Greek, that we think, oh well, because we have the internet and because I heard a few people talk about this, I actually know the real answer now.
I watched a couple of Facebook episodes.
I know the real answer now, and that's why I'm even careful of like, I am always like, but this is where I got that from, and that's where they got that from, and that's where, and trying to take it back, and even me, I'm not like, oh, this is something I came up with or something that I think is right. It's like, no, I have a basis in education and study that this has been reaffirmed over and over and over.
But again, you believe in absolutes.
Yeah.
That goes back. You actually believe someone knew something and passed it on, and you build as a building block, which I thought we always have in civilization as a building block. Now we have to tear everything down and start over. And I think that's what's dangerous with all our toys and gadgets and intellect and computers and all that. We're wanting to unplug everything and say, let's flush everything. Nothing we've learned in all these 6,000 years is really absolute, and let's start over and go back and retest everything.
Yeah.
So to get into talking about the word and talking about absolute, some of the stuff that you come up about, like with Plato and Aristotle and some of the stuff like that you were talking about, I just thought that was, I've heard it before, but the way you put it kind of concise in a nutshell about the Word of God, about why is the Bible a big deal to us or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think to some people that are listening today, this may not, they may, oh yeah, I know that. But there were people in the sermon that were older than me coming up and going, I had no idea. And it helped solidify some people. So kind of get into that a little bit.
Yeah. I'll try to go through it quickly because, again, I worked it all out in the sermons. So you can check that out. But a lot of times people will say, well, the Bible is just like any other holy book. It's just like any other historical document that, hey, it's good because of its history and because it's been around for so long, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's different than anything else. And so what I talked about is, Plato and Aristotle, the earliest copies we have of their works. We don't have the originals, but the earliest copies we have is from 1,200 years after they were written.
So there's no originals.
Yeah, and people think like, and no one
How do we know they
questions.
existed?
Yeah, no one questions whether the original existed. No one questions if something had been changed. They're just like, oh no, this is an exact copy. The earliest copies of Julius Caesar's historical work is from 1,000 years. The smallest gap of kind of a famous piece of literature is the Iliad, Homer's Iliad, and it's still a gap of 400 years. And we only have, in that time frame, only one manuscript. So it's not even like we have a bunch from 400 years.
How do we know Homer wrote it?
So, and then I got into and I said, okay, well, if the Bible's like all those others, what about the New Testament?
Okay, just the New
because
Testament.
the Old Testament, I understand it's a little bit harder with the dating because it was so long ago. But let's consider the New Testament because those others were written around the time of the New Testament. We have a fragment of John's Gospel dating to approximately 30 years after it was written, and there are 100 portions of the New Testament dating to the first 150 years or so after its writing. We have 6,000 manuscripts from the early centuries, which have a textual agreement amongst 99.5%. And the 0.5% is only from copying mistakes such as a comma or a period or a certain letter kind of being off, but there's no doctrine.
That was huge when you said that.
Yeah, there's no doctrine. And what I told people is I was like, if I told you to sit down and write out the story of what's happened in the past 6 hours today at the office, and you had to write 6,000 copies, you wouldn't be able to have 99.5% accuracy.
Let me give a proof for all the super followers out there. In the last 40 years, I have preached certain miracles, certain stories, certain things hundreds of times. Same story, same scenario. I was there. and don't even tell the story exactly the same, because I may tell it funny. The basic facts are the same.
Yeah.
I don't even realize I may have said I had a white, or I was there in my suit and my tie.
Right.
I may not even had a tie on, but my brain's thinking I did. It doesn't take away the facts of what actually happened.
Because all the doctrine stays the same.
But it's the story.
Right. The doctrine stays the same. And then also telling
facts
people,
stay the same.
I didn't really get into this as much, but so many people have this thing of like, well, I mean, I heard it just a few days ago. The Bible has, it's been changed so many times, been edited so many times. That has been true. There's been times, but in 2022, the translations we have now are the most accurate that they've ever been, because we have access to the most documents.
Yes.
And nowadays, a good translation, your standard translation, such as the ones that are trying to be very accurate, such as your English Standard Version, your New American Standard Version, your New English translation, your Christian Standard Bible. These are all English, of course, because we're English speaking. There's others in other languages. But they all have a plethora of people that are peer reviewing the work, whereas in the past, such as like the original King James, it wasn't people peer reviewing and challenging each other. And then also, they didn't have access to nearly as many manuscripts 500 years ago that we do now. So language, because of archaeological digs and stuff, we've gotten so much more accurate than we've ever been before. So people that are like, it's been changed. At times it has been, but now there's been corrections that have removed a lot of things that would have been from cultural bias, or, well, this translation group, it was only a few people translating it, so they had their own agenda. No, nowadays it's going to be people from all over the world. It's going to be men, women. It's going to be young, old. It's going to be all
denominations.
Yeah, and even some translations even bring in non-Christian scholars, because they don't have to believe it to be able to translate it. So anyways, getting back, it says, and so we have those 6,000 Greek manuscripts, but then also we have 20,000 manuscripts. Now, remember, we only had like one of the Iliad. 20,000 manuscripts that were translations from Greek into other languages. So again, remember, the New Testament was written in Greek, but then you're translating it,
20,000
when it's going to Africa, when it's going to Europe, when it's going to Asia, when it's going, all these different places, especially back then, the dialects changed so much from place to place. 20,000 manuscripts, and when you translate them back, they all match. They're all still saying the same thing. So it's really illogical to say, well, these other historical documents are true and haven't been changed, but the Bible isn't true. When it supersedes by thousands of times, a multiplier of thousands exceeds the documentation and the things. And then I'll get into just really quickly, and so we're running out of time, but I was like, well, what about other holy books? Well, if you don't know, and these are major world religions. Obviously there's so many religions, but these are the major ones. The Bible is 66 books written by 40 authors. Pretty much all of those authors, we know exactly who wrote it. It's stated in the book who wrote it. There's only a few that there's kind of a debate on, but who wrote it doesn't change the fact that it's true.
It was written. That it was written.
And they wrote it over a span of 1,500 years, and it's all coherent. It all agrees with each other.
Ties together,
The Quran, and again, I know speaking about the Quran, speaking about the Prophet Muhammad can be very easy to offend, and I want to just say with all grace, but the Quran was written by one person, the Prophet Muhammad, and then it was compiled and distributed he had multiple wives, so one of his father-in-laws, Abu Bakr, is the one that compiled it and then distributed it. But people want to say, well, that's divinely inspired, and I'm not going to argue about the divine. I'm just talking about the facts of one person, and then it was distributed by a relative. So it would be a lot easier for them to collaborate and to conspire on some things versus 40 different authors, different languages, different cultures, different parts of the world, over 1,500 years, and it's still all lined up.
And also know at the time of the Quran, he had the Torah and the New Testament.
Yes, it was 600
and
years
all world
after the
history,
New Testament.
600 years. So he had church history, and he had what I would call church hurt or culture hurt from different things
Christians
that were going
coming in,
on. Christians coming in as invaders. So yeah, you have that whole thing going on when this is written.
So, and then copies of the Quran, we have 2 fragments of the Quran that are believed to be the oldest, not believed to be originals, but believed to be the oldest. And carbon dating put them at the late 6th or earliest century CE, which is what science and philosophy uses, or AD. So it's maybe 50, 100 years after the prophet wrote those. So only two fragments.
2 fragments.
And even that is still, again, we have New Testament from 30 years. So 50 or 100 years is still a lot longer.
And 2,000 copies.
Yeah, and we have 2,000 copies. Then you have the Book of Mormon, which was written by one man, Joseph Smith, in 1830. And he said that an angel led him to find these golden plates, that there was prophetic words, and apparently there were prophets in the Americas, and I believe the 6th and 7th century, that maybe the 5th and 6th century, that apparently wrote these and left them, and they were revealed by God
to the American Indians.
But the tablets have never been produced; they've never been shown to anyone, and then also those people who supposedly wrote it have never been proven academically. Whereas people we know it's not really an argument that there was a man named Jesus who had disciples who died by the Romans, even if you don't believe he's the Messiah. We know there was a man named Paul. We know there was a man named Peter. But we have no history of these prophets.
Sure.
No
reference outside of that book of an angel Moroni.
Yeah.
You look at Gabriel or you look at Michael or whatever, there are so many different references of them, Old and New Testament, all these different areas, and even cultural references.
And there's even debate, that a lot of the Book of Mormon was copied from the King James Bible, and that's a whole other thing we can get into. But then again, it was distributed by a small he wrote it, and then it was distributed by a very small group of people. And it was not, multiple people had this same revelation and they all came together and said, we all had this revelation. We all believe this. It was one person, and then people just believed him. And then the last one is, within Hinduism and Buddhism, there's really not one canonical text. There's really not one central text. And so it's hard to kind of compare the Bible because
their whole religion is based on no absolutes.
Yeah, so a lot of what we're seeing now in philosophy and stuff, it really is just Eastern religion. A lot of Hinduism, and as far as a polytheistic culture, or with Buddhism, they don't really have a God. The self is the God. You're trying to reach the highest place of enlightenment, and that was kind of a debate, maybe 20, 30 years ago, of people like, Buddhism sneaking in, and people like, I don't really think, but now you're seeing that it's become such a factor.
Part
but
of
again,
our culture,
but again, if you believe there's no absolutes, it's hard to debate any of this. But if you are someone that's like, I'm looking for the truth, I'm trying to make a logical decision, it's very hard for me to say, okay, look, just even these are very simple facts that you can find. It's hard to look at these and say, okay, well, the Bible is just like all the rest of these. Okay, one person wrote it, 40 people wrote it. There's a big difference.
Over 1,500 years.
Yeah,
which
there's
is
a big
mind-boggling.
difference in it stands out to me.
Yeah.
You have to at least give the Bible the fact that it stands out among other ancient literature and among other where even scientists, and I couldn't get into this, and I'd have to look back in my notes, but there was a scientist. Let me see if I can find it really quickly. But he is he's not a Christian, not anything. But his name's Andrew Parker. He's a British scientist and evolutionary biologist. He's director of the Natural History Museum in London. Pretty big deal.
Pretty big deal.
So
We've been there.
That's where we have the largest collection of fossils of all these different things.
Yeah.
Who does not himself profess to believe in God, but upon engaging in the subject of is the Bible fact, he said he found a whole series of parallels between the creation account in Genesis and the scientific accurate. That it was scientifically accurate, but it was written long before the science was known. So how did the writer, this is a quote, how did the writer of this page, the early creation account in Genesis, how did the writer of this page come to write this creation account? I must admit, rather nervously, as a scientist averse to entertaining such an idea, that the evidence that the writer of the opening page of the Bible was divinely inspired is strong. I have never before encountered such a powerful, impartial evidence that the Bible is the product of divine inspiration.
Wow.
So that's from a book written by a man named John Lennox, Professor John Lennox of Oxford University, a
Wow.
book, 7 Days That Changed the World, and he's quoting
From the creation.
Andrew Parker, who's the
Wow.
director of the
Wow.
history, the Natural Science Museum.
And I know
Natural
we got to
History.
go, but I think that leads us to this whole thing that truth is a person, not a philosophy. Mm-hmm. And Jesus said, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the Word became flesh. And I want to kind of get in and tie that up, because we say that at Oasis a lot, but you said it Sunday, and you just really tied into this so well, is that truth is a person. Mm-hmm. And that the way that the person of Jesus Christ is revealed is through the Bible. And so the eternal Word of God, heaven and earth will pass away, but His Word, not this paper, but His Word that causes creation will never pass away.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the reason this is so important to us. We're not just talking about history and all. We're talking about, does Jesus save? How does Jesus save? And how are we not saved?
Mm-hmm. Well, and my point, and again, I won't preach it. You can go listen to the sermon. But my whole point is we got through all that, and I was like, okay, I had to do all that to get you to the my message was really only about 5 minutes after
classic Suber.
After the science.
Classic Suber, 5 minutes.
In Genesis 3, one translation's, a more modern translation said, "Did God really say?"
Yes.
That's what the serpent says
Did
to
God
Eve.
say? Yeah.
And if I believe if the enemy, Satan, can get us to doubt the Word of God. We believe that there's power in the Word of God, where when we confess the Word, when we confess the promises of God, that it has the power to bring life, to bring death, to bring healing, to bring change, even supernatural circumstances that are going on in the world, different things. But if the enemy can get us to doubt that, then we lose our power over him. So if the enemy can get us to believe,
absolutely,
and it just becomes a morals and if I'm a good enough person, there's no power in that. We believe that none of us are going to be good enough. Our power has to come from that Jesus is perfect, not from how good can we get. And so I believe that it's no new tricks that the enemy. I quoted John chapter 8, I think it's 36, where it says, "Who the Son has set free is free indeed." He knows that if he can keep us from the Word, then we'll stay bound. And that's kind of the big, everybody's like, there's a lot of history and stuff, but the takeaway for the people that are listening or watching is, there may be an area in your life where you are bound, whether it could just be a thought process, it could be something that you've learned, has become a generational thing through your family, and you're stuck in that. And it could be because you don't have the truth. Because it's the truth that sets us free. Yeah. It's not our striving. It's not our work.
Yeah.
You can do all of those incredible things, and that's what I said, is you can listen to worship music and listen to podcasts, but if you don't believe that the truth has the power to set you free, you're going to stay bound.
The truth is Jesus.
Exactly.
I love what you said, that in the garden, you're saying that is God never said the reason why they weren't supposed to eat.
That's
and I love what you said, is that God doesn't owe us an answer.
Yeah.
So that's this whole thing. We literally think that God owes us an answer and an explanation of why He has.
Because again, if I don't understand it, if I don't understand it, how could it be true then? Because my truth is the ultimate truth.
So if I don't believe in God, I'm God.
Yeah.
And that's the whole humanism, which is where we are. All of this boils down, you said it a while ago, nirvana, but it all goes back to humanism. Is kind of where we are. Like one of the fathers of the guy that they kind of followed, you mentioned that, from the Nazism. Heidegger.
Yeah.
Just kind of say that before we go, because I studied some of that after you said this Sunday. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so he was one of the what's known as the postmodern philosophers, like capital P's, that created some of this thought. And he ended up being a Nazi, or was a Nazi, and he's actually quoted, I'm sure it happened more than once, but actually going into a university in Germany and telling people that, everything you've been taught, everything that you know about the world, throw it out the window, and now whatever the Führer says, that's your truth. And so going in as a person of power, as a person that's respected, as a philosopher, telling people, hey, the Führer, Adolf Hitler, is now truth. And so I know that's an extreme example. People hate when you go to Nazis because they're like, oh, they think it's so extreme.
Yeah.
But again, it's if there is no truth, where does the road end? You're always going to go more and more humanistic, more and more what works for me. And we didn't even get into all this. We don't have time, but every society that bases itself on Judeo-Christian, it's not perfect. I understand that. But those societies, those countries are the ones that have fought for women's rights, for the rights of LGBTQ. There's no LGBTQ rights in Syria and the United Arab Emirates, but in Britain, in America, in Australia, in Canada, there's rights for everybody. France. And so it's crazy to me that these places where you look at communist China, you look at North Korea, you look at Russia, when you take away that there are no absolutes and that a man makes up the rules, it's always going to end in chaos.
Well,
it's always going to end in destruction.
You said it, son. It's whoever screams the loudest, whoever lasts the longest, whoever has the most weapons.
Whoever digs their heels in the longest.
They become the absolute.
Yep.
And so now, and you mentioned that because a lot of us, you're watching us on a podcast, but a lot of us Facebook or Tumblr or now TikTok and all that it's whoever does the most and whoever is listening, whoever has the most money to put out the most information.
Yep.
Even in education, whoever's putting out the books that are going into schools, that's what truth is going to be, whether it's truth or not.
Oh man, we could get into that too.
Yeah.
Well, man, I thank you guys so much for listening. Again, like I said at the last episode, this is something we're going to be discussing more, both on this channel and on our personal channels and different things. And so if this is something that resonated with you, maybe you've been thinking about this, or maybe you weren't super aware of it, and it's something that you need to be made aware of, we would love to know just what you're thinking and love your support. So make sure you hit the like button, you comment on this video, and really share it with someone. I encourage you, share it with any college students you know, share it with family members you know, and maybe it doesn't answer every question, but maybe it can just give them some places to look. And I'm just praying that it'll bring some truth into every area of their life. So we thank you guys so much, and we'll see you next time. All right, so let's just look at the camera and smile.